So it's all here. The story of our time with the barcode. There is no record of a mistake or an unpleasantness or criticism that is not included in the files here. This library will show the facts, not just the joy and the triumphs, but the sorrows and the failures too.
Hello and welcome to Hardie Party of Five and a Half. Welcome, babe.
Huh?
Hello.
Well, I'm just cleaning out my desk. You know, I stuff all kinds of stuff in my desk.
You
and
do.
Then years later, I figure out what's in it.
Right?
But I was just looking through these papers that look kind of odd. I don't...
Yeah, what do you have there?
What? This says White House, top secret, confidential.
Babe, what?
Oh, my... Have we had a president come over that I don't know about? How did these get in my desk?
How did those get in
What
your desk?
I need help, babe.
I know.
We're in
Well,
serious trouble now.
Before Nicolas Cage comes and tracks you down, put those aside because I have just the person that you're going to need. His name is Mark Lawrence. He's the director of the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas.
So maybe he can help us figure out. I don't know if he can help us how to figure out how these got in my desk, but what do we do with them now?
That's right.
And
He's
what
just
is the
guy.
National Archives about? Because we've heard it so much in the news now.
That's right.
So what is this really all about?
Well, if we want to know all about where classified documents should be,
Yeah, exactly.
and a ton of other things like presidents' wives' dresses and their china and all the things that I find interesting. Listen, we've got just the podcast for you. You're going to love this interview with Mark Lawrence. Mark, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. This is like a fascination of ours and a lot of people. So we appreciate you taking time with Hardie Party of Five and a Half.
No problem.
Before we start with these questions, inquiring minds want to know, how does one get your job? Like, how did you get to where you are?
So that's a really good question. There are, I guess there are 13 presidential library directors right now, and it is a total mixed bag. There is no good single answer to that question. There are people who've come to these positions through the National Archives bureaucracy, basically with archives backgrounds. There are people who have worked at other museums and kind of museum administration. And then there's a couple of us like me who are basically academics.
Okay.
And came more to presidential libraries through doing research and, being involved in conferences and public programs and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You got to read a lot of
Yeah.
books to be the director.
Yeah.
In some cases.
Well, that's true. Although people think I think one of the reasons why it's sometimes hard to get UT Austin students to come over here is that they think, oh, it's a library, right? It's a place full of books. But, we actually don't have that many books. It's a library in the sense of holding all the original documentary material from the Johnson presidency.
Yeah. Well, that's a great thing because like right now we've got a lot of historical documents in the news. Oh my goodness, all the time, every day.
Classified documents everywhere.
Oh yeah.
So what's in your house? No, I'm just kidding.
All right.
Don't answer that.
or the garage.
Yeah, the garage. And do you have a Corvette? So what did people used to do with those before like the presidential libraries? Like what was historically done with his documents?
Well, there's no single answer to that either, which is one of the reasons why it's great to have the National Archives and the presidential library system. Presidential materials were understood to be the personal property of the president. And just like with any of our personal property, it tended to get scattered here and there. I mean, some of them set up, libraries or small institutions that might host or even still host some of the papers, but some, were left with family who might, have lost them, or they might have been destroyed by fire or other, problems that came along. Yeah. They might have been sold. So basically, this material tended to get scattered and in many cases lost over the years, which is a sad thing for historians trying to reconstruct the history of those earlier periods.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
So where did the idea for the library come? We have all these papers scattered in no organization. So where did the idea for the library come from?
The library, so there's a simple answer to that question. The idea for the presidential libraries came from Franklin Roosevelt. I think that's a pretty clear-cut reality. So Franklin Roosevelt decided that it was tragic that all of this material was being scattered and in many cases lost, and decided that he would establish a presidential library that would hold all of his papers from his very, very long presidency and very, very consequential presidency. And he also set aside the space where this would happen as part of his estate in Hyde Park, New York. So he had a nice place to build this library and to make sure that his papers would be preserved and made available, right, to the American public. So that was his real innovation, was to acknowledge that even though technically all of these papers were his own property, they in many senses belong to the American public and were part of American history, and therefore should be available to American citizens and others as well, for that matter, to come and inspect for their own purposes.
Yeah. And we've definitely partaken in a few of those. We love
Yeah.
Oh yeah, like the Bush is cool.
Yeah.
Like you just mentioned, it's not just books. Like at the Bush, the W as I call him because we're close friends. At his, there's a lot of interaction as far as like you can sit down and they give you scenarios that a president would have to face, and it gives you like a simple idea of how hard these situations and just these decisions are, because then it'll have a bombing has happened here. How do you react as the president? You get four choices.
Exactly.
So when we hear presidential library, there's so, like you said, there's so much more to it that I think we don't realize how interesting all this is. It makes you think about things. So
yeah. Well, as a director of one of these, I'm delighted to hear you say that. I mean, certainly one of the purposes is to, get people to think critically and deeply about their history. And one of the ways to do that, if your subject is a president, is to try to take visitors into the dilemmas, that confronted the president during their presidency. And almost any, president, I think every president who has a presidential library, probably every president across American history faced, really difficult decisions, sometimes enormously consequential ones. So, what to do about Iraq in the aftermath of September 11th, in the case that you mentioned, what to do about Vietnam in the case of Lyndon Johnson, what to do about the atomic bomb in 1945, and on one could go. So, what we try to do here certainly is to take our visitors inside that decision, to expose them to the different pressures that operated on LBJ, and not necessarily to come to the same conclusion that LBJ did, but at least to appreciate why the decision making shaped up in the way it did.
Yeah.
And you realize they're people. Like it's a person trying to make decisions just like we would. And I think when we're just on talk radio and all that, it's easy to make a caricature of everyone that you're talking about. So it's nice to have these libraries where we can see the full person, maybe a fuller person.
Yeah. I'm again delighted to hear you say that, because that's certainly my hope and my intention here at LBJ. And it's difficult sometimes, right? Because in these palatial buildings that are given over to the legacy of presidents, you can start to lose track, I think, pretty readily that, okay, there's a real human being at the heart of these stories. So the sheer grandeur of these buildings and the kind of sacred quality of of our task of preserving all of this stuff can sometimes undercut exactly the very important point that you make about how important it is to recognize that these were real people subject to emotions and and political pressures, and they were tired and grumpy and all the rest at different times.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think we're fortunate to have, like in Texas, there's 3 that I know of. Is there more than 3?
I think only 3, right?
There's 3, right, in Texas?
3, that's right. And one just up the road in Little Rock.
Oh, okay. Yes, that's right. Are you in a group message with all the other 13 directors? Like, do you guys share a group text?
Yeah, text. No, that's a good idea. No, but email.
I think it's kind of cool. I mean, there's only 13 of you. Like, that's not.
That's true.
Yeah, you guys should have a group text. I think that would be a fun
Yeah.
thing.
Okay. There's an opening. There are actually, oh man, 2 or 3 openings right now. So it's an even smaller little club than
Oh,
is ideal. But we certainly email all the time, and we
cool.
meet periodically as well. During the pandemic, we met twice a week, for long stretches of time. So
Really?
that was one of the real upsides of the pandemic, as far as I'm concerned. I got to know these people
Yeah.
Yeah.
much more intimately than I would have if we had just been carrying on as usual.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so who pays for these presidential libraries and who decides where they get to go?
So the president himself, hopefully herself, before too long, will gets to decide where they go. Usually in consultation, of course, with a private foundation that president establishes, usually during the period when they're in office, and that private foundation is usually, is in charge of raising the funds for building the institution. So the short answer to your question is that these institutions are privately funded through the work of a foundation that's established during the presidency, with the goal of establishing a presidential library. And this goes back to the pattern established by Franklin Roosevelt a very long time ago. The institution is then turned over to the federal government to operate on behalf of the American people.
Okay, and then they decide where to put it.
Or the president decides.
The president decides where to put it.
Right, exactly. I think, the presidents, of course, are making these decisions based on where they trace their own roots and where they want to leave their legacy. But, I think you can see as well that they make these decisions based on where their institution is most likely to draw visitors and researchers. So unsurprisingly, many of them, at least since the LBJ Library was established, are located on university campuses. I think this is a good partnership in every case where this has panned out, because you have a kind of built-in community of scholars and students who presumably can make use of the records, and will have a deep interest in the public programs and all the other kinds of activities that happen under the roofs, typically, of presidential libraries.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so the National Archives, we're hearing a lot about it in the news now with all the classified documents and all that. So describe that system to us, and then tell us how the presidential libraries fit into that.
So you're right. The presidential. Sorry, can I start that one over?
Yeah.
The National Archives has historically been a fairly low profile bureaucracy, and I think that makes everybody happy who's connected to the National Archives, right? This is a thoroughly nonpartisan agency of the executive branch that performs an essentially custodial function for the American people. Basically, the National Archives stores, processes, makes available the documentary record of American history.
Right.
And National Archives, the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, has 40-something facilities scattered across the country. The biggest facility is the headquarters, located just outside Washington, D.C. in College Park, Maryland, although there is also the old National Archives building on the Mall, which is where visitors can go see the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and other foundational documents. But the National Archives has facilities, as I say, all over the country. Some of these are simply record centers, meaning that they are big warehouses of documents, and they have reading rooms, so researchers or ordinary citizens, for whatever reason, can go there and look at materials that may interest them. But 13 of these 40-something facilities are presidential libraries, like the LBJ Library. So we're part of a system of repositories of records, but the presidential libraries are special in the sense that they also have much more of a public face. They have public programs, educational programs aimed at teachers and students, and museums that are the reason why most people come through our doors.
Yeah. Yeah. I think most of us really know about these things because of National Treasure, the movie. That's pretty much
Right.
all we
We have to steal
that's
the
like really
Declaration.
all we know about, like where these
Yeah.
things are kept.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like the extent of our knowledge for the most part.
Well, and like you mentioned, it's kind of meant to be in the background. It's not meant to be the national news. So it's probably for people that are doing that job, it's weird to be in that public setting, hearing all these questions and stuff about your job. You know, it's like,
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's an uncomfortable position to be in
Yeah.
because, the core principle at the heart of what the National Archives tries to do is, I would hope, and I think most leaders of the National Archives would hope, is a non-controversial one, right?
Yeah.
We store, make available, process documentary records so that American citizens can come and inspect the history of their own nation. And underlying this is the idea that the availability of this record to the scrutiny of ordinary citizens is a fundamental dimension of a healthy democracy. So, I think one of the troubling things that's cropped up recently is, some questioning about how this process works in practice. And given the importance of the underlying principle, I think it's an uncomfortable position to be in when those kinds of questions are asked.
Yeah, for sure. I can imagine.
So you mentioned earlier that earlier in history, the president's stuff was considered private for the most part until Roosevelt did that. So now are there things now that are private and public, or is everything considered public for the president?
So this is a really interesting question. So the answer is a little bit complicated. So Franklin Roosevelt established the first presidential library, but the operating assumption at that time was still that his records and all of the artifacts and gifts that he was given in his role as president were still his personal property. And that principle held all the way until the late 1970s. And it's only with the Presidential Records Act of 1978 that Congress established legislation specifying that presidential records were actually the property of the American people rather than the individual president, him or herself. So this was a really landmark moment in the history of presidential records and of the National Archives and Records Administration. From essentially the Reagan administration forward, this legislation was adopted under Carter, but from Reagan forward, the presidential records were the property of the American people from their creation. And this gave, of course, the National Archives a much more direct role in managing the material, in claiming the material literally on the day that the presidential administration ends, and then beginning the process of consolidating it, processing it, and making it available.
So was that inspired by the whole Watergate, Nixon, we need to know what the president's doing kind of thing?
That's exactly right. As in so many arenas of American life, some really profound reforms in the area that we're talking about came about in the late 1970s as a result of Watergate and other events that seem to suggest that some really fundamental reforms were necessary in order to close down opportunities for corruption and mismanagement.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So the first ladies, have they always been involved in presidential libraries, and how has that changed over time?
I think it has always been a significant part of what presidential libraries do. For one thing, the First Lady's materials have, I can't think of an exception, been part of the material that has come to the National Archives and to the presidential libraries as a kind of central part of the record of the administration in question. But First Ladies have also been played up very much so, I think, in the museums, which again is the reason why most people come through the doors to see a presidential library. I think all of them have exhibits. Certainly we do. I can't think of an exception focused on the lives and careers and inputs into the administration of the First Ladies. I think that first ladies have played quite different roles in different administrations, perhaps unsurprisingly. The general trend across probably all of American history, but certainly across the 20th century, has been from a relatively passive first lady, perhaps with responsibilities in the arena of the social life and social activity of the White House, to more engagement with policy questions and more engagement with the political work of the president. There are certainly exceptions. I say that's generally the trend, but we can see Eleanor Roosevelt, maybe the quintessential policy-oriented first lady. She was back in the 1930s and 1940s, whereas Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy, right, was somewhat more comfortable being in the background, at least when it came to policy questions. We've had Nancy Reagan, who had policy ambitions, or Lady Bird Johnson for that matter, but Melania Trump, not so much, right? So there's been some fluctuation, even as I think Americans have come to expect more of their first ladies and take it in stride now that first ladies are out front as political and policy spokespeople for the administration.
Yeah. That's funny because when we go to libraries always, or even museums, he beelines towards like the history. He wants to look at the battle scenes and all that stuff. And I'm like, but look at this dress he wore when he was baptized.
Yeah, right.
The personal person.
I'm all about the personal person. You better believe I want to see Melania Trump's clothing up close.
Exactly. Yep. Clothing in China is another thing that people love, and with good reason. It's really pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I want to see all that.
Yep.
Okay, so at the start of the episode, we played a clip of when LBJ, the groundbreaking of the museum. And in that, he mentions that he wanted the good and bad to be in the museum, which I think is a good thing. Like you say, we can make these a little too reverential, and you're not a cool person or anything. So LBJ just seems like a really complicated guy. So can you kind of take us into just a snapshot of who this guy was and how that affected his policies in his presidency?
You're right that at the dedication of the library 51 years ago, LBJ said, it's all here and we're going to make it available to the American public with the bark off, was his very Texas way of phrasing it. And, that's a slogan we use a lot here at the LBJ Library. I think I can say that everyone who works here is really dedicated to as much openness as we can reasonably have, even while respecting that there are some reasons to keep things secret, either for national security reasons or reasons of privacy.
Yeah.
But LBJ, you're quite right, was a larger than life figure, enormously complicated. And I think, but there was one characteristic of LBJ's in particular that I think stands out in the minds of every biographer, every historian, no matter where they've come down on his complexities, and that is his persuasiveness. He was enormously persuasive. He knew how to twist people's arms and craft arguments and use inducements and sometimes even threats to get what he wanted. And I think where this shows up most importantly is in his relationship with Congress. So LBJ was, by some measures, the most effective president in all of American history, maybe second to Franklin Roosevelt, in getting legislation adopted, right? Hundreds of bills, many of them profoundly transformative, were approved under LBJ's presidency with his strong support. So here at the LBJ Library, our most iconic object, is a little bit boring, I have to admit, is the signing pen. We have many exhibits throughout the library that is literally a stack of pens, which suggest all of the legislation that LBJ signed. So it's this enormous outpouring of transformative legislation that I think is the most important legacy of the LBJ Library, of the LBJ presidency. And of course, here we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration Act, numerous bills connected to education, the environment, this whole array of domestic policy initiatives that we know, and LBJ gave us the lingo to talk about this, as the Great Society.
Okay, so you have LBJ, and we know he's kind of the Texas guy, kind of irreverent, you would say. And then you've got John F. Kennedy, who seems like the quintessential Northeastern, little uptight, a little more formal probably. So how did these two guys get along, and after Kennedy was assassinated, how did LBJ kind of take some of that Kennedy legacy with them? And first off, how was their personal relationship as far as that goes? And how did he weave in Kennedy into his own thing?
Yeah, really interesting question. So I think that it's clear that JFK chose LBJ as his running mate for purely political reasons.
Yeah.
JFK understood that he was a Northeasterner. He was perceived, although we could debate whether this was accurate, as kind of a liberal within the Democratic Party. So he really needed a Southerner, someone who is perceived, and again, we could debate whether that was an accurate perception, as a more conservative figure. So LBJ was made to order. He was a very powerful Senate Majority Leader in the late 1950s and very early 1960s. He had a very high public profile. He had himself been mentioned as a presidential contender back in 1956 and then in 1960 as well. So LBJ kind of checked all the boxes. But I think, given the importance of politics in that choice, it's perhaps no surprise that LBJ wasn't the guy that Kennedy was going to go to for advice, on every issue that came down the road. So LBJ was quite frustrated, I think, as vice president by the fact that he was largely marginalized. He was given a few areas where he could, focus his prodigious energies. But the vice presidency were, in some ways, I think many of his biographers would agree, the most frustrating of LBJ's, maybe his entire political career, because he was so marginal from the real action, which was, focused on Kennedy himself and the advisors that JFK prized, and very much including his brother Robert Kennedy, who is someone who LBJ particularly detested, and it was very much mutual. So, LBJ suddenly arrives in the presidency in November of 1963. And, his relationship at that point to the legacy of JFK was really, really complicated. On the one hand, JFK was very popular. In fact, he had become significantly more popular during his presidency. So LBJ had to be really careful, right, to try to use JFK's high political standing, the enormous outpouring of sympathy given the tragic circumstances under which JFK had been assassinated. And yet LBJ was very much his own man, who had, and of course, he had wanted to be president for a long time. And here now was his opportunity. So he really had to balance, I think, using Kennedy's legacy, living with Kennedy's legacy, exploiting it to the extent that he could, and also trying to carve out a niche for himself. And I think many biographers, including ones who've been fairly critical of LBJ, would acknowledge that he did a pretty good job with that. He really found ways to harness the sympathy for Kennedy in the early days of his administration and scored some important legislative accomplishments right away in 1964. But over time, LBJ was able to step out from under JFK's shadow and really, especially after his sweeping presidential victory in 1964, kind of, establish himself as the dominant figure, and really to get people to think of the Johnson presidency as a true Johnson presidency and not just a continuation of the Kennedy presidency.
Yeah.
Well, and when you talk about that stuff, my mind goes to sports teams, because we like to think like our favorite teams that are really good and do great things. We like to think everybody likes each other and, they're just all great friends. But when we hear about it, most of the time there's strife and there's people don't like each other and you'd rather not be. But I think at the same time, that friction is what helps you do good things. It helps you move forward, I think. So like you described with Kennedy and LBJ, they're like, we don't really like each other, but we're going to make
I think there's something to be said for that. Absolutely. And even during LBJ's presidency after the assassination, I think LBJ was very good at at finding ways to build coalitions
Yeah.
on whatever the issue of the moment might be, whether it was civil rights or poverty or education or immigration. So he took and there may be a lesson for our own time in this, he took it as a given that, look, people in Congress, Americans, may not like each other, certainly don't agree with each other on policy questions across the board at all times. But on any given issue, there are opportunities to create coalitions. You can find points of commonality among people who at first glance might not look like they have that much in common. And I think LBJ's real skill, again, going back to his persuasive abilities, was to cobble together winning coalitions, very much bipartisan coalitions, on a shifting array of issues, especially in 1964 and 1965, when he was really riding high.
Yeah, that's true. I think we could use a little more of that these
Yeah,
days.
that's a good lesson for us.
Yeah, for sure.
So visiting the library, the presidential library, what can somebody expect? Like, give us just a couple of highlights of like your favorite things. You told us about the pen.
The pens, right. Yeah. And I do acknowledge that that's a little bit boring. So yes, we have we have more exciting things than that. I think the centerpiece in terms of our artifacts, the centerpiece of our museum is the desk on which the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed. It is literally in the center of our museum. When recently Nancy Pelosi, the vice president, other dignitaries have come to the library, that's where they want to have their photo taken. And that suits us very nicely, because I think that voting rights desk really is symbolically the core of what Lyndon Johnson stood for, at least in the domestic arena. But we have other really interesting items. We have a moon rock. LBJ was, as many Americans know, maybe one of the things that every American knows best about LBJ, was very much involved in the space program, the Apollo program. And he wasn't president when, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, but it was clear that LBJ had an awful lot to do with making that event happen. And so, unsurprisingly, we have a moon rock, which is not a large piece of rock, but is nevertheless pretty cool. Yeah. And I think one of our prized possessions. But you mentioned earlier the First Lady's clothing and the china and that sort of thing. We have an ample supply of those types of objects as well, which are very, very popular with our visitors.
Yeah, that's nice.
Okay, we're gonna put you on the spot now. We're gonna do the little ranking. We ask you a few things for you. We're gonna take LBJ out of it because we know it's the best.
Of course.
We don't even need to go there. So below LBJ, what are your personal top 3 presidential libraries, and why do you like them?
All right, yeah, you're going to get me in trouble with my
trying to get
with my colleagues
all fired up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm going to say probably at the top of that list, after LBJ, of course, would be the Reagan Library, and the reason for that, I mean, I suppose there are several reasons. I mean, the material there is so rich and largely unexplored because a lot of it has become available only in recent times. A lot of good work still to be done on the Reagan presidency. But the museum is really spectacular. It's huge, for one thing. It's the biggest museum in the system. It has Air Force One in it, right? That tells you how big it is. People can see Ronald Reagan's 747 in that exhibit. And by the way, the setting in this beautiful part of California is just so spectacular that alone is worth going there for. Yeah. So I think I'd put that at the top of the list. I'd also certainly put the Kennedy Library pretty high up there. In some ways, architecturally, it reminds me a little bit of the LBJ Library, but where it differs from LBJ is its setting on Boston Harbor. Really beautiful spot right at the edge of the water, which I think is appropriate given JFK's origins and his time he spent on Cape Cod, his love of sailing and all the rest. I think I'd put that in second place. And the other one I would mention is the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. Maybe not the most exciting town in the world, but a very interesting town without question. But the reason I would put that on my list is because the museum exhibit at the Truman Library has just been renovated. It was finished actually during the pandemic, so that in a sense was well timed because the building was closed for some time while they installed new exhibits. But it's really amazing. It's really state of the art when it comes to museum technology, museum design. So I would strongly urge anyone who's interested in presidential libraries to check that one out. One of the oldest museums in the system is also now one of the most cutting edge.
Huh, that's really
Okay,
cool.
this is great because
Yeah.
if we're close to one when we're traveling, we try to go to one.
Yeah.
So now these are at the top of our list.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think you'll be disappointed. I think a lot of folks might agree that those are top three.
We went to California just over Christmas, but we had our two boys with us, and they had a whole slew of things they want. We were going to a Charger game, Laker game. We couldn't fit in the
presidential
But
library,
honestly, we probably don't want to go with them. Honestly, we want to be able to
to kind of savor it more.
to savor. Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough.
So we need to. For many years we've been checking off baseball stadiums off our list, but I think they do sell those little pop charts where you just scratch off the stadiums. They need that for the presidential library if they don't have it already. That is a selling point.
There's a passport that I think we stole this idea from the National Park Service, honestly.
Yes.
There is a passport that people buy these things.
Yeah, I think our kids had one and they were doing the monuments.
Yeah, we did.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I think
exactly.
Need to get the passport.
We're going to start stamping them off.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, you got to come to this part of the country first because I think we have the densest cluster of libraries.
We've been fortunate enough to see a few of those. So, Mark, thank you so much for talking to us today. This has been a fascinating conversation. I have learned so much from you, and I appreciate all that you do for history and keeping things alive and making things accessible to us. So we just thank you for spending time with us this morning. It's been a great conversation.
Totally my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, do you know what to do with those documents now?
Well, my first thought was to burn them. but I think maybe I should just take them to Mark and let him put them where they need to be.
That's right. I think he can figure it out.
I think that's probably the best idea.
I really love that interview with him because I just feel like I learned so much more, and it made me want to go out and go to all of them. We really need to check those off our list.
We need to get a passport and start punching those off. We've kind of done it informally, but we need to make it more of a formal trip thing that we're doing. And
I love that when we leave, there's something for both of us there, even though you're way more into the history side and I'm more into the emotional connection side, that when we leave, it's hey, I learned all of this. And you're hey, I learned all of this. And then we put it together and look at all the things we learned.
I know, it's pretty cool. It's pretty amazing. But, I'm a little distracted because I'm still nervous about these documents, babe.
That's right.
I mean, I've got them all over my desk and in my desk. And
babe, you got to take care of that.
I'm going to go see Mark right now.
Go.
I'm going to go down to Austin, hand these papers over, and I'm going to feel a lot better before Nicolas Cage can do anything to me.
That's right.
Okay, I'm out of here. You're going to have to sign up for that one. Mark, here I go.
Go get it, babe. Well, I guess we're done here. Hardie Party of 5 and a half, over and out. We'll see you next time.
Okay, I've made it to LBJ Library. I cannot wait to go in, and I cannot wait to get this to Mark. So the weight of all these classified documents will be off my shoulders. The LBJ Library is located on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin. It was dedicated in 1971 and is one of 13 presidential libraries now open. The library houses 45 million pages of historical documents. Let's go in and see what we got.
LBJ was a force of nature. It was just a human dynamo.
If you walked in the room, you would know it if your eyes were closed and your back was turned. Oh my God, there's LBJ.
It's a tornado in pants. Larger than life.
The good news is that anybody who ever worked for Daddy became part of his family.
Wore out people who were half his
Bad news is that anybody who ever worked for Daddy became part of his family.
The single most intelligent man that I've ever known. Totally honest and calculatingly devious.
Sheer raw brute intelligence. Could be thoughtful, caring, and
It was
generous.
just this internal engine in him that could not stop.
Tough, demanding, cruel.
All of these opposites clang together inside him.
The library has an animatronic LBJ that shares popular LBJ one-liners. as well as a timeline of his life from his birth in Stonewall, Texas in 1908 through his career as a teacher in San Antonio to his rise to the Senate and then ultimately his presidency from 1963 to 1969. LBJ loved phones, and he had them all over the White House, wherever he was. You can pick up a phone at the museum and listen to conversations that were recorded during his presidency.
Interest and your cooperation and your communication, and a good many people told me that they heard about your statement, I guess on TV, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
I've been locked up in this office and haven't seen it, but I won't tell you how grateful I am and how worthy I'm going to try to be of all your hopes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to hear that, and I knew that you had just that great spirit, and you know you have our support and backing.
Well,
because we know what a difficult period this is.
It's a destiny.
The museum has a great exhibition on Lady Bird Johnson. She was the first lady to interact directly with Congress, and she employed her own press secretary. You'll see dresses and china, and you'll just get a feel for what it was like to live in the White House during the 60s. You can even walk through her personal office in the museum. She also campaigned heavily for her husband and went all across the country drumming up support for him. She was also an advocate for beautifying the nation's cities and highways. After LBJ saw that Harry Truman had his own Oval Office in his museum, LBJ had to have his own. It's a 7/8 mock-up of his Oval Office. Director Mark Lawrence took me behind the scenes where they have a private area to hold special events at the museum. From the awe-inspiring atrium area, you can see the 5 floors stuffed with presidential documents. Truly a one-of-a-kind experience, deep in the heart of Texas. Okay, I just had a fascinating tour of the LBJ Presidential Library. And Mark came down and talked with me for about an hour about presidential stuff, classified documents, all kinds of fascinating... Oh, wait. Classified documents. I forgot to give him this. Oh my, I gotta go back. I hope I don't get arrested. Rebecca, you'll be my one phone call.